Few books have the kind of positive ratio that Andy Weir's The Martian has on Goodreads. And even fewer people get to see their blog post hobby converted into a multi-million-dollar blockbuster starring Matt Damon. So how the hell does Andy Weir write such fun books? And are they part of a balanced science fiction breakfast? That is what we are going to be talking about today.
Use the cable for the Cosmaster skyline! Anchor it with the rover!
Weir writes books that rewards readers for thinking like an engineer or a programmer. You take a big challenge, you break it down into littler challenges, you rinse and repeat until you have tasks that are easily solvable, that by putting them all together, you solve whatever your big problem is, whether it's road tripping across the Martian wilderness or working with things that literally eat starlight for breakfast or whatever Artemis is about. Full disclosure, I did not read Artemis before writing this essay. He uses this structure that's familiar to his core audience, this sort of very left-brained narrative style of problem, solution, back to back to back, to create a nerd power fantasy. Right? So you can science the shit out of death's jaws. You can escape certain death by being smart, by knowing the right trivia, by putting the right ingredients together. Sort of like there's a formula you can know. You may not know the exact problem that comes before you. You know, Watney's consistently surprised. But you can, if you know the right things, you can survive. This really appeals to the kind of, nerd lifestyle of collecting trivia, knowing things. It's all very in your head, very cerebral. And that's the kind of narrative that Weir is giving people. He's creating this nerd power fantasy. But I don't think that this is actually as unique as we might think. He's doing interesting things with it, but he's actually relying on tropes that predate the genre in which he writes. Dr. Philip Smith argues in his paper, The American Yeoman in Andy Weir's The Martian, that Watney represents a very specific trope that's a quintessentially American archetype, the yeoman farmer. For those of you having a sudden flashback to AP US history, this is the same yeoman farmer idea that Thomas Jefferson is obsessed with. The yeoman farmer carves civilization out of an unyielding and dangerous wilderness. Other Old West archetypes don't really fit with Watney. Smith argues that Watney lacks the violence of the American cowboy and that the mountain man archetype lacks Watney's need to return to civilization, or at the very least to carve out some semblance of civilization on Mars. The mountain man is more of a at one with nature sort of vibe, not a bending nature to his will. Weir repeatedly grounds Watney in American pop culture, and specifically with references to pop culture that depicts an idealized version of the American West. Weir succeeds in something that's impressive here. He writes a yeoman farmer novel that finds an audience. Farming is rarely compelling. The yeoman farmer is way more likely in sort of your classic Western to be a side character who's more of a hapless victim of the circumstances of the story than to be the protagonist, right? Like the John Wayne cowboy type rides in to save someone like Mark Watney. You don't make him the main character. By separating the yeoman from his usual companions, his safety net, Weir raises the stakes, which makes a novel-length potato word problem receive praise like the purest example of real science sci-fi for many years. Utterly compelling. Watney opens his first log post with, "I'm pretty much fucked," and every problem solved leads to another potential fucking. Weir described this narrative function in a 2014 talk at Google.
What I wanted to do was have the problems. I didn't want him to just get struck by lightning over and over, I figuratively. I didn't want there to be too many coincidences. So I wanted all of his problems to either derive from the fact that he's using outdated equipment or that he's using equipment in ways that it wasn't intended to be used. So the solution to his previous problem would often cause the next problem.
This always on death's door urgency increases the frequency of built tension to relief. Where many books will add to that tension slowly, chapter over chapter, Weir presents problem, fuck, solution, whew. Problem, fuck, solution, whew. on repeat. It's undeniably fun if you're willing to hop on the ride. But fun doesn't necessarily equal good, at least in my estimation. There's just nowhere for Mark Watney to actually grow as a character. He never really grapples with the emotional angle of being left alone and abandoned on Mars. We get these offhand references to depression and that he's sick of listening to disco or watching Three's Company. But Weir has a tendency to leave lulls out of log entries where other authors might provide characterization to let us see more of that internal life of this diary that we're reading, right? Weir leans much more heavily on just cutting to the next action-packed science word problem. Let's take a look at another movie with lower stakes and more headroom for character growth.
On the 4th of October, 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched history's first man-made satellite into space orbit around the Earth.
October Sky is a fantastic film, especially for space nerds, that looks closely at the life of real-life rocket scientist Homer Hickam and never goes to space. We meet Homer at a point where he's at a competency deficit.
How do you think it'll fly?
Well, I got it packed with the powder from 30 skyrockets. 3-4 miles. You ready?
Yeah.
10, 9, 8.
Should we get behind something?
He lacks the knowledge and skills to do what he wants. This is different from Watney's problems on Mars. Watney is always competent. He just needs time to puzzle out the solution using his toolbox of competency. We get to watch Homer assemble that toolbox, including friends that he collaborates with.
Do you know anything about rockets?
Of course I do.
Yeah, you want to come with me over to the library?
No.
What do you want to know about rockets?
Everything.
Weir shoots himself in the foot with the tiny bit of characterization he gives Watney. Watney hates being told what to do and engineering by committee, so even when he makes contact with Earth, he sends ASCII boobs and complains about them wanting to review actions before he modifies life-sustaining HAB systems. One of the core themes of the book is a critique of bureaucracy, that simple decisions shouldn't have to go through 12 desks and a ream of paper to be made. You might think this is a reflection of Weir's personality. Authors and programmers can disappear into the void and re-emerge having built a thing. But Weir wrote The Martian in public view, chapter by chapter on his blog. He corrected science mistakes in collaboration with fans. His real-life experience impersonating Mark Watney required valuing the input of other people. The viewer goes on a different odyssey with Homer than they do with Mark Watney. Homer meets problems that he can't solve, and he seeks out the tools to solve them, learning, growing, and overcoming adversity throughout the story. He's a fully realized character who recognizes his dependency on others while remaining an active protagonist. October Sky, admittedly, lacks the edge of your seat, here we go energy of The Martian, but what it lacks in popcorn, it makes up in character depth for the protagonist. And it features my favorite space admiral, Laura Dern.
It would have just kind of seemed like a technical manual or a really dry sequence of events. I needed something in the narration itself that would keep the user interested.
Something that Weir does exceptionally well and has developed over his 3 novels is the ability to invite readers to solve problems alongside his protagonists. Project Hail Mary does this really well, and sometimes to a fault. The Martian keeps problems pretty heady. They can be difficult to solve on your own, or they require knowledge of Watney's specific systems that you haven't, maybe had revealed yet on a first reading. Dopamine hits are doled out as relief when Watney figures out a solution. The tension is again raised when the next problem is identified. Weir maintains the interest of a user by cranking up the frequency of problem, solution, problem, solution. You might remember Gary Paulson's Hatchet. The Martian is Hatchet with the frequency of problems grossly cranked up. You don't know Mark Watney the way you know Brian. We see Brian's despair and his growth as he learns to shape the Canadian hinterlands to his will. The stakes are nearly as high, but we get so much more depth out of Brian as a character, and This is the most important part in my thinking. We can celebrate Brian's wins that much harder for knowing him and caring about him. Watney's solutions are satisfying in a way that seeing a puzzle solved is visually gratifying, but not as satisfying as Brian's solutions to problems, or those solutions Weir employs in Project Hail Mary, where we see Weir's reader as user philosophy emerge fully formed. At its best, Weir leads you to solutions in Project Hail Mary. You realize just ahead of Grace what he's going to do. Weir does a good job establishing the rules of the universe in the book in a way that he takes for granted in The Martian. Because in The Martian, it's the real world, dummy. Keep up. The addition of astrophage and a sentient alien race to the universe in Project Hail Mary requires a thorough presentation of how this new reality works. Weir carefully defines how astrophage modifies our understanding of physics. He explains Rocky's anatomy and environmental needs in detail. Our intimacy with the tools helps us arrive at solutions with grace. And that's a powerful thing to do in a book. Trying to get readers to track with, heck, get ahead of the main character damages one of Weir's best resources. He's smarter than me, and he's willing to put in a metric shit ton of work to craft solutions to equally well thought out problems in The Martian. The dude wrote a program to show him where the Earth, Mars, and the Hermes were in relation to each other throughout the course of The Martian, so that all of the communication could be accurately delayed. Project Hail Mary pulls users deeper into the story by relying on a cheaper tactic than that employed in The Martian. Weir presents thinly veiled middle school science questions as opportunities for the user to play Jeopardy with the novel. This is especially pronounced in the audiobook. Can you shout out ammonia before Ryland Grace realizes why Rocky's ship smells like cat piss? Weir makes the reader feel like a special boy for doing big science. And don't get me wrong, this makes the book more fun as you consume it the first time, but it detracts from the rereadability of Project Hail Mary. It's like winning Trivial Pursuit by becoming familiar with the trivia on all the cards in your box. It's not fun anymore. Weir downgrades his protagonist's intelligence with a literal hit to the head to improve the user experience of the novel, and as a consequence must downgrade the challenges Grace faces. But he certainly doesn't dial back the stakes. In Project Hail Mary, the entirety of the human and Iridian races are on the line. It cheapens the novel to rely on my realizing astrophage smells like shit because it's being killed by Taumiba to get us closer to saving two worlds. So Project Hail Mary is, in my opinion, more fun than The Martian. I think the humor is a little more mature, and the user participation of figuring out the challenges myself enhanced my enjoyment of the book. I usually try to let a book roll past me without predicting things, but I found myself excitedly explaining what I thought Grace would do to my wife, who was trapped in a car with me for 12 hours on a road trip. So far, we've only addressed Weir's writing style and the structure of his stories, but I think another interesting theme lies beneath the Martian surface and has been effectively unearthed or unmarsed for us by Dr. Smith that I mentioned earlier. The Martian belongs to the literary tradition of using Mars as a site of masculine escapism. The authors that Weir cites as influences on himself, Heinlein, Clarke, Asimov, and Bradbury, all write into the tradition of Mars as the next frontier. They're writing in a transitional period where Westerns are still being made. The previous frontier is still being won on TV and theater screens across America. Martian sci-fi is tied to depictions of the Old West. This early stuff reflects contemporary attitudes about the West. It's a wild space in need of taming, including the inhabitants. The possibility of life on Mars meant that humanity's expansion would mean subjugating the Martian natives. As we learned more about the environment of Mars and it became clear it was a wasteland, we were able to kind of conveniently abandon notions of conquest for narratives of peaceful settling, the kind of narrative most often presented today to young Americans about the bloodless and fictional settling of the American West. By centering the perspective of the settler on a world without natives, we dodge difficult cultural conversations. Narratives that have historically gloried in the power and privilege of white men are now repurposed without dealing with their toxic elements. The cultural narrative shift dovetailed perfectly with our shifting understanding of Mars and provides a playground for modern sci-fi readers to enjoy stories that reinforce the idea of a victimless colonizing process. Stories of modern Martian conquest would have to grapple with modern conceptions of the rights of Martians, would question the power dynamics at play in relationships between space cowboys and the beautiful green-skinned Martian princess that Watney wishes for. The Western has been deconstructed. and is, for the most part, a dead genre that needs a solid premise or a crossover to make it work. Westworld is a great example of blending Western tropes and sci-fi while asking interesting questions. When modern sci-fi authors like Weir appropriate the themes and tropes of the Western into sci-fi uncritically, even conveniently sidestepping the problem of a people to be conquered, they enable continued engagement with troubling narratives without challenging the reader. And I know that I'm sucking the air out of the room here, but these discussions matter, and there's no air that's breathable on Mars anyway. Obviously, Andy Weir can write whatever kind of fun romps he wants, and I'm not saying The Martian is a bad book for engaging with Mars as it actually is, rather in the way books that engage in straight up pro-colonialism and pro-conquest stories do. But Weir tries to have it both ways. He's endorsing the tropes from older Martian fiction via jokes and references, but then he doesn't have to grapple with the ideas while getting to benefit from their cultural cachet. Look, Weir writes a fun-ass novel, especially when the empathy gap between you and the main character is as narrow as possible. The pacing in The Martian and Project Hail Mary is great. I think in the third novel, he successfully covers a lot of flaws you might question if you had more time to think about them. I think interrogating our entertainment and the inspiration of our entertainment is an important part of a healthy media diet. What captures the popular imagination about our future now will inform how we act to build that future. And speaking of building the future, this is the kind of content I'll be making here. If you enjoyed this, subscribe and like and press the bell to uncritically consume all of my thoughts. Remember, you don't need to interrogate the inspiration of this entertainment or my biases because they're the good ones. Don't worry about it.